Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wagmi TV. We're going to jump right into it today. We have a really exciting topic. It's been kind of the talk of Twitter for the last few days, inspiring a lot of debate. And so we figured we'd kind of join that debate. And so the topic for today is going to be SBF's regulatory framework that he recently put out less than a week ago. Joined, as always, by the homies, the Wagmi TV squad. We're going to be giving you everything you need to know on this topic. We're going to tell you the pros, what we kind of like about, the framework that he put out, and the main negatives, and the reason why we think this poses a huge risk in terms of some of the things that he's proposed, a huge risk for the future of crypto. So getting right into it, we got a little bit of a slide deck here prepared. So as mentioned already, we're going to be going into SBF's digital asset industry standards, right? He put out a piece about a week ago, really detailing what he feels to be, in terms of a few different topics within the crypto industry, what he feels the best regulation would look like within the crypto industry. And so, whenever anybody in terms of for the stature of SBF, right? Somebody with a lot of power, clearly a lot of money, a lot of investment, and generally just a lot of sway over the industry, puts out something that has to do with regulation. Obviously, people are going to listen. But at the same time, it's, important to note that we kind of want to take this with a little bit of grain of salt, right? SBF manages a multi-billion-dollar company within the space. And he obviously has his own self-interest, at least partially, at play here. So that's one thing that I'll say before even getting into it. And I know, Garcia has a few other kind of tidbits before we hop in, just to kind of set the stage on where we are here in terms of crypto regulation and SBF's place within that realm.
So if you guys have done any research into this or looked into it at all, you've probably been seeing some, immediate backlash to some of the things that he said, and a lot of the criticism really comes from SBF's background. So he is one of the youngest and first billionaires in crypto outside of creating a technology. So what I mean by that is, obviously, Vitalik's a billionaire, Charles Hoskinson, Connor Cardano's a billionaire, but they got there from a technology standpoint. And not that SBF doesn't understand technology, but he did it more from a business standpoint with FTX and managing that. And the other thing that comes into play is he's very, very well-versed in the political sphere. So since he's become wealthy, and even a little bit before that, he's been involved in political campaigns. He has a lot of connections in the political sphere, especially in America. So he's contributed, $40 million alone to the current midterm elections. And there's actually one of the largest, top 5 largest donors to Joe Biden in his 2020 campaign. And he's previously said he wants to donate. He walked this quote back, but he previously said he wanted to donate over $1 billion in his lifetime to political campaigns. And that received some backlash, so he walked it back. So there's a little bit of context behind that and why crypto investors and people in the space are a little wary of what he has to say on regulation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, not to mention, right, I think he's the second youngest billionaire, the richest person in crypto at this point, and he's been the one who's kind of been bailing out a lot of these organizations. Like, I think we talked about Voyager, we talked about BlockFi. So very much involved, kind of has his tentacles, if you will, everywhere amongst the space. And so it's something to keep in mind when he puts something like this out. Again, like Soham said, super relevant. A lot of people are going to listen. And so, take it with a grain of salt and then have your pros and cons and go into it with that kind of outlook of there might be a little bit of bias in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So jumping right in, right? What are the real topics that, he covers? So he covers kind of 7 main topics within the entire piece. I'm not going to go into everything that he covers because it is kind of a longer piece. What we are going to do is we're going to link it in the description below. So any of our viewers, feel free to go check it out there, and comment with any of your thoughts as well. We're really curious to hear what folks think. The dialogue about this stuff is definitely very important. What I will say is he does welcome a lot of feedback. And so that's exactly what we're doing. We're doing our part within the space in terms of reading what his thoughts are, and we're planning on providing our own feedback. So he goes through, number one, hacks. What is a security, right? The age-old question that, the U.S. government has yet to answer. Tokenized equities, customer protections, disclosures, and suitability, sanctions, allow lists and block lists, DeFi, and finally stablecoins. So those are kind of the 7 things that he covers. In terms of what I liked, right? I'd kind of divide it into three areas. One is his proposal on hacks. I thought his proposal on hacks was actually really interesting. Hacks is a really tricky topic, right? We read about hacks all the time, and it's how do we even prevent this from happening, right? His framework is kind of interesting, right? It's more of an industry standard versus a government regulation, which is kind of nice to see, as opposed to a government trying to apply a one-size-fits-all to this situation. It's more of just an industry standard. And what that industry standard is basically based on is the customers come first, which is, I think everyone can agree on that. And then also the way he set it up is basically the hackers, for finding that vulnerability within that smart contract and then liquidating all the funds, which is usually what happens, instead of just running away and probably, who knows what they're going to do with the funds, if they're even going to be able to withdraw them. It's a whole process, right? It's no fun for anybody, right? Everyone loses all their money, and then this hacker has to figure out what to do. Instead, it's basically treated as a bug bounty, where the hacker is able to give back the majority of the funds. The customers are made whole first. And after that, the hacker is actually able to keep a certain percentage of the money that they found as a reward for finding that bug bounty, right? And the protocol gets to keep the majority of their funds. The customers are made whole. Everyone's happy. I personally thought that was a pretty good way to go about it. Hacking is something that what else are you going to do, right? There's no real great ideas on how to stop this. And so I felt this made sense. The next is tokenized equities. The interesting thing that he goes through within the article itself is the number of entities that a retail trade has to interact with before settlement actually occurs, right? Before, let's say I go on Robinhood and I buy a share of Microsoft. How many entities actually get hit in that process? Or let's say Charles Schwab or Fidelity or something like that. A retail trade has the potential, not every single trade does this, but has the potentially to hit maybe 15 or 20 separate entities before that trade is actually permanently settled, right? You compare that with DeFi and crypto, and you're just interacting with another counterparty or a smart contract. Your trades are pretty much, once that block is mined or once that transaction is validated, the settlement is done, right? So it has the potential to help retail trading a lot, which I also, agreed with. And then when he talks about scams, I kind of half agreed with this section. The parts I agreed with, and we can go into the stuff that I didn't really agree with, in a bit, but the part that I agreed with was with the idea of transparency, right? I think a big problem in crypto is the lack of transparency. And, when you see rug pulls happen, when you see false advertising, when you see things like that, which are pure scams, I don't know. I don't care how libertarian anybody is. I think everyone can agree that if somebody is out to just straight up scam people, they should be able to be prosecuted for that, right? If you're out there just trying to straight up scam people and steal people's money, there should be consequences. The government should be able to go after you and hold you accountable for doing that, right? And so those are a couple of things, providing transparency in terms of what your product does, no false advertising, and holding people who try to scam, scammers, accountable. I think all of those things that he mentions in the piece are things that I can get behind. So that's kind of the rosy part of the picture. So now we can kind of cover, the cons. But before I hop in there, does anybody have any thoughts on these few things that I covered just now?
Yeah, I mean, I mainly, so the first two pieces on the proposal on hacks and tokenized equities were personally my two favorite parts, because they're both very, very investor and customer centric. Because if you think about the idea behind a bug bounty, it's to improve the code behind every project, which ultimately in the long run protects more investors that are going to come in after that. And then the improved settlement process, protects people from vulnerabilities through going all those different entities, saving percentage points on different fees, stuff like that. The scammer stuff, we can get into it, but it wasn't as clearly defined as I thought it would be. Like he talks about them being more transparent. He talks about finding the suitability between what the consumer should be of that product and then kind of going through based on their net worth or based on their income, like what that target is. So I wouldn't agree as much on that, but the first two pieces I was a fan of.
Yeah, that part that you bring up right at the end there, the suitability and like those categories is exactly in this section what I really didn't agree with. And so we can kind of get into that here in a sec. Let me just switch the slide here. Boom. All right, cool. So what are the things that are really kind of rough? And in my opinion, if these things happen, it'll really change the future of crypto and potentially basically remove the United States from any sort of meaningful kind of competitive spot within the crypto space. So definitely things to keep a lookout for. One was blacklists, right? We all saw what happened with Tornado Cash just a few months ago. And the thought of that being the norm is just not a place where we want crypto to get to, at least in my opinion, right? What basically blacklists do is they're limiting transactions at the blockchain layer, right? And if you think about what CBDCs, whenever they come along, are going to be able to do, it's essentially that, right? It's going to be some entity that's able to block you from transacting at the blockchain layer and be able to basically invade your privacy and stop you from doing what you want to do just because they can track what you're doing, right? And so when we go from, Tornado Cash being a one-off thing, keep in mind that the whole Tornado Cash situation, when they said, the USDC and the ETH and all this stuff that was interacted with Tornado Cash is now frozen, we all saw the, tangential effects of that, which are a lot of good, normal, law-abiding citizens getting negatively impacted, right? And so if we turn into a place where blacklists are regularly kind of put into effect, we're going to see asset freezes happen all the time. And having that be the norm is just not a crypto environment that I don't think anybody wants to be in, right? On the same kind of topic, he brings up the concept of the OFAC. And for this, I want to bring up what is the OFAC, right?
And really quick, Soham, just
yeah.
to circle back to that Tornado Cash example, we saw that basically if any of the wallets that use Tornado Cash were to send currencies to other wallets, those wallets would get blacklisted. And what that meant in like the action standpoint is that the person that owned that wallet that had currency sent to would basically have to file a claim or report to, I believe, the SEC to basically say, hey, this wasn't a transaction. This was just somebody sending cash to my wallet. Right. And now I have to go through this whole bureaucratic process just to be able to get my wallet unlocked again. So it was a huge hassle. And like we always talk about, like a terrible customer experience or user experience within the crypto sphere here. So yeah, I mean, it has created major problems just in that Tornado Cash example.
Right. No, I couldn't have said it better myself. Completely agree. It just has so many unintended consequences. So here, coming back to the OFAC, right? Basically what SBF says is OFAC standards and sanctions should be applied to like crypto and basically the broader crypto environment, right? And so what does this actually mean, right? So this is actually an office that's part of the United States Department of Treasury, right? So automatically you have like a government agency who is handling these things. And we're basically going to be putting our trust on basically saying that, okay, these guys are the guys that know best, right? At the same time, if you're on this sanctioned list, it is literally illegal to do business with any entities on this list. Now, you might say, okay, like, what are the entities on this list, right? Like, if it's like, the top 200 most wanted people in America, then maybe this makes sense, right? Like maybe it makes sense. But then you go and you look at this freaking list. I mean, this thing is almost 2,000 pages long, probably like 8-point font of just like entities on entities on entities. Who even knows what all this stuff is? You bring it back, there's entire countries on here. And this is where it starts to get problematic, as you can see, right? This goes against pretty much everything we know and we feel like we know about the crypto environment, right?
And like one of the biggest value props, right? It's like it kind of just flies in the face of really the reigning open source ethos of what crypto is supposed to be and blockchain is supposed to bring to us as a technology. It's just that equal access for all. So I get it to an extent, but I think that's one of the pieces that he's hoping to, maybe change his opinion a little bit on and kind of get our opinions and see what everyone likes to think about that. But I completely agree with you on that, where that just feels almost anti why a lot of people have kind of accepted the crypto space and been super about it. So completely agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the countries on that list, and like I think we can all agree that regardless of the regimes in those countries and the rationale for why that is, like that doesn't mean that all those citizens of those countries are like should be sanctioned or whatever, right? Like those most of those people are probably just normal law-abiding citizens, just like everywhere else in the world, right? And so all of a sudden, for me to not be able to trade with that person on a decentralized exchange, or like send that person an NFT, or like where does the line really start and stop there, right? It doesn't seem to make that much sense. So the blacklists and the OFAC stuff is something I definitely didn't really love, say the least.
You brought up a good point there, Soe, where it's like a slippery slope, right? Because in the piece, the paragraph after he talks about OFAC, he says, on top of that, trusted actors should be able to make a list of people that they suspect are involved in criminal activity, or for some other reason they should be on their own list. So basically that opens up the idea that, whatever trusted actors means, those people can actually build their own list to then sanction individual people, or individual entities aside from countries that are on this list. So it's just, if you start with this baseline, it can only get more restrictive,
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
It's almost like a gateway for centralized entities to start to take control, at least partly, of the flow of DeFi and kind of the crypto space in general.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really, really good point there, Mata, because I think when I was thinking about like what is the broader theme of his entire piece, it just fell on basically barriers, right? Right now, crypto and DeFi and everything, and we can get into it on the next slide too, but it's about limiting the amount of barriers, right? It's about anybody anywhere can have access to financial tools that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to a lot of the times, right? And a lot of the stuff that he's proposing adds barriers to the point where all of a sudden you're taking away that what's so awesome about crypto in the first place, right? So yeah, just getting into the scamming stuff. I mentioned stuff that I agreed with on the scamming side, and Garcia brought up exactly what I take issue to on that section about scamming, which is like he's talking about how to protect customers, right? And he's saying, okay, we can either we can do almost like an accredited investor thing where it's like you have to have X amount of net worth, but that doesn't work for XYZ reasons. He brings up a bunch of other alternatives that we could potentially do. And he lands on knowledge tests to use protocols, basically, right? To use different crypto tools, which just seems like such an insane barrier to entry that it would heavily limit what would be possible and the types of innovations and stuff that would be possible just inherently, right? Going back to the topic of barriers. So that was kind of that last piece. Did you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I think there's two ways to kind of look at this. When you look at some of our Web 2 examples of restrictions in that space, there's certain URLs within Google Chrome that, because they're not an HTTPS URL, your browser's not going to take you there. And I totally understand that. That's something that we've grown accustomed to. And at the end of the day, it is for a user's safety. But I totally agree that, knowledge tests are not the way to go about this. This is something where we've seen voting laws in the history of the U.S. Require knowledge tests for people to place votes. And you see a lot of groups become marginalized because of this. And so it's something where, sure, maybe theoretically in Sam's brain, it makes sense, but the ways it can go wrong are just so many, and it's really not the way to go about that, in my opinion.
Yeah, when I saw that piece, I just it just seemed really, really hypocritical to me, because if you ask the average person that's invested, let's say, in a Fidelity account or something like that, or is involved at all in investments, or is using a large bank, if you gave them a quiz and said, hey, define asset, define liability, define cash flow, define what an ETF is, a lot of those people that are involved in that aren't going to be able to do that. And so I feel like it was just a little bit hypocritical that we wouldn't do that with the central banking system and then have people do it with crypto.
Another barrier.
And then the barrier of them all. This is the section that I really, really didn't like as a, big DeFi head myself. This is the one that I thought was particularly flawed, this section. So I'm going to take you through a couple of quotes and then his final quote, which together seemingly make no sense, basically. But so the initial quote is, the following activities would potentially require some sort of license or registration, etc. An American hosting a website on AWS, for example, that actively provides a front end that encourages and facilitates U.S. retail users to trade on decentralized protocols. Actively marketing DeFi products to U.S. retail investors. That's the first quote. Next one. If you host a website that makes it easy for U.S. retail to connect and trade on a DEX, decentralized exchange, you would likely have to register as something like a broker-dealer. Keep in mind, broker-dealers have to go through a crazy amount of registration and now let's just unpack what those two quotes mean right there. The realistic end game of that, a world that looks like that in DeFi, is you have to provide basically what you would need to get a bank account or something, like KYC information. You'd probably have to provide an ID, passport, something like that, in order to trade on Uniswap or trade on Curve or trade on any other decentralized exchange that you would, be interacting with. You might even have to, if you think about what is, a front end that encourages and facilitates U.S. retail traders to trade on decentralized protocols. That could be Etherscan. Are you saying that you would have to have KYC to access an Etherscan? That seems absolutely insane. Then you think about it from the website perspective. If you host a website that makes it easy for U.S. retail to connect and trade on a DEX, all that basically means is Uniswap would have to have KYC obligations. Uniswap might have to register as a broker-dealer. Keep in mind that a broker-dealer is a custody relationship, right? A broker-dealer basically has to go through a lot of regulatory scrutiny because they are actually housing people's funds. They're keeping custody of people's funds. Here, you're saying you basically have to register as a broker-dealer when it's a smart contract, right? It's literally code. There's nobody there keeping custody of anyone's cash or anything. So this is really what made no sense to me. And then to top it off, he ends it by saying on-chain code and DeFi must remain free and open and uncensored, which is clearly, just completely the opposite of what these previous two things are saying. So that was basically my big issue with the DeFi section. To be fair, he did say he wants to take feedback and stuff on it, and that's why we're here trying to provide the feedback that we can. And obviously, a lot of other people have too, which is why this has been such a hotly debated topic over the last week or so. But curious to get what your guys' thoughts are, particularly on this DeFi stuff.
Yeah, that was a great breakdown. So I think the biggest criticism I saw about this online, which you kind of alluded to at the end there, was that by default, if you're going to have these broker-dealer relationships, all these authorizations, regulations, to have this stuff set up, that by default means that you're bringing in most likely the SEC or some other government body to regulate essentially every decentralized exchange that comes into existence. So the biggest criticism was like, okay, well, here we go. Now, like, the government gets involved in every single crypto project, which is like the whole opposite meaning of what crypto is supposed to be. So I think you laid it out pretty well.
And I guess a question for you, C, on that, is that any decentralized exchange that like is technically registered in the U.S.? How far can the U.S. government or the SEC reach with this stuff, like across borders?
So probably a more SOE question, but my assumption would be that if the LLC is registered in the United States and it's opened up as a United States entity,
right,
it'd be regulated by the SEC. Or my other thought, and someone can correct me on this, is if there's a certain amount of funds that are U.S. based in the actual technology itself, where it puts enough of U.S. funds at risk where it needs to be regulated by the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I honestly don't know. I mean, based on the language here, it says an American hosting a website. So I don't know if that would make it so that it's like illegal, even if you're an American, like in foreign country or something doing this as well.
Right.
But it's just weird. Like, there's no regulation on like who can start a website, and all these like front end DeFi stuff. Like, all it is just basically a front end to access the blockchain, right? That's all it is. It's just giving you front end user-friendly information of what's already out there on the blockchain. So,
right,
I don't know. It doesn't make much sense.
It's almost like the U.S. government is forcing themselves into these, protocols and saying, "Hey, we're going to regulate your API access," because that's what they're saying is, sure, you can. I mean, right now you can create a website that then hits their APIs to make these trades for you or these swaps. But in the future, if you want to be able to get authentication tokens as a developer to create a website where you want to send data that says, hey, this person wants to swap this token and this token, or trade this token and this token, we're not only going to make you go through the company's like API procedures, authentication procedures, which is usually pretty extensive for financial applications, but then also go through the US government's, which is crazy. And I think something that we've talked about in past videos is that when you look at how the internet was started, they took this approach where they didn't want to stifle innovation. This feels like they are doing exactly that. They're stifling the possible innovation that you can do as a developer. And it's really not the approach that they should be taking, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think my general take on all of this is that regulations absolutely needed in the space, right? Not just for customer protection, all the things we've been talking about, but also to make this more of a legitimate asset class, bringing in a lot of these larger organizations so that they feel like it's safe as well, right? So from an investor perspective, also very key. I think, to Evan's point, one of the biggest things is not overstepping that boundary, especially within the United States, and then having some sort of brain drain from the United States out to other countries that have less strict regulation on some of these things. So general take is a couple really good tidbits. I love the pros, right? Specifically like the bug bounty thing. Not only does that help for the customers, but that does also help these chains in bettering their technology and making sure they are fixing those bugs as appropriately as possible, while also protecting those customers in the basically in the face of some of the issues that they've created themselves. But the biggest thing is having discourse like this to understand what some of the impacts are of some of the regulation that has been kind of pushed out there. And so I think Evan's point is extremely valid, where we need to be very, very cautious and careful of the next steps we take, especially in regards to if this is just for the United States, because something that we did really well for the internet was make it pretty loose from a regulation standpoint, which is what brought all the innovation, all the technology, why people wanted to continue to develop on it, all of that. So very, very careful, super needed, but this discourse is super important.
I do want to bring up one point to kind of bring this full circle. I'm going to pull this back up. And this is why I think, particularly in this point, where people felt that SBF was being disingenuous. Because if you look at everything he's asking for here, keep in mind that FTX is a custodied financial institution, meaning that every single thing he's asking for here is stuff that his company has to do. That also means that he is under direct competition with DeFi, right? Like, he is a centralized finance entity that does crypto trading. That is FTX. He's obviously got his hands in other projects like Alameda and stuff like that. But when we think about FTX, that is their business. Decentralized finance and like Uniswap and decentralized exchanges and being able to swap completely permissionlessly is, I mean, from his perspective, he wants them to have the same regulatory pressure that he has, right? Because that's his direct competition. So I think that's probably what spurred a lot of, the thoughts around, him being disingenuous and him trying to ruin DeFi and all this stuff, is because in this particular case, in the other ones, not so much, but in this particular case, he does have a lot to gain from this particular regulation that he is proposing. So does anybody have anything else? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up here. Just a little food for thought to the viewers.
I think that's a great way to wrap it, Zoe. It's been pretty obvious that there's been, some quite a response to this post that he had to this piece of legislation that he wanted to put together. So there will be another version that comes out, and we will have to do another because it'll be interesting to see how far he sways and on which topics. There's going to be a lot of changes, but I would be surprised if this DeFi section doesn't change a lot, to your point, Zoe.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, to Evan's point, he's actually said that he's going to be making changes on this regularly. So we'll be absolutely, tuned in, dialed in here on Wagmi TV, paying attention to all the latest and greatest as always. And we'll keep you guys updated on the latest on SBF and the regulatory saga that ensues. So till next time, signing off, the Wagmi boys. We'll see you guys on the next one.